The restaurant stood on one of the busiest streets in the city, where glass buildings reflected the evening lights and expensive cars lined the sidewalk. Inside, everything shone. Crystal glasses sparkled under warm chandeliers. Soft music floated in the air. The scent of fresh bread and grilled food mixed gently, making guests feel welcome the moment they stepped in. It was the kind of place where people came to celebrate promotions, close business deals, or simply show that they could afford it. Among the wait staff moving quickly between the tables was a young black waitress who worked there almost every night. She kept her posture straight, her steps careful, and her smile polite but not forced. She had learned that in a place like this, customers expected service without seeing the effort behind it. They wanted their water refilled before asking. They wanted their plates cleared quietly. They wanted attention without feeling watched. She gave them exactly that. Most guests never looked at her twice. To them, she was just part of the background, like the white tablecloths or the soft music. But her coworkers knew she carried more than just trays. She carried responsibility. She worked double shifts whenever she could. She rarely complained. If someone needed help covering a table, she stepped in. What the guests did not know was that she went home each night to a small apartment on the edge of the city. The paint on the walls was old, and the furniture did not match. But it was clean. It was home. She lived there with her mother and younger brother. Her mother worked part-time but had health problems that made long hours difficult. Her brother was still in school and needed help with homework most evenings. That was one reason she never called in sick. She could not afford to. There was something else about her that almost no one at the restaurant knew. When she was a child, her father had taught her how to play the piano. He had not been rich or famous. He had worked as a mechanic during the day. But every evening, no matter how tired he was, he would sit at their old upright piano and play. Sometimes he played classical pieces. Sometimes he made up his own music. He used to say that music was the one place where a person could speak without being interrupted. She used to sit beside him, her small fingers copying his movements. He was patient. He would guide her hands gently and tell her to feel the keys, not just press them. "Listen before you move," he would say. "The piano speaks if you let it." After he passed away, the piano was the hardest thing to let go of. They had to sell it when money became tight. She remembered watching strangers carry it out of their home. She did not cry in front of them. But that night she pressed her fingers against the kitchen table and imagined the keys beneath them. Since then, she had not owned a piano. But sometimes, when the restaurant grew quiet between shifts, she would glance toward the grand piano near the bar. It was mostly for decoration. On weekends, hired musicians played soft background music. During the week, it stood silent, polished and untouched. She never dared to sit at it. That evening started like many others. The sun had just set, and the sky outside the large windows was deep blue. She tied her apron, checked her order pad, and stepped onto the floor. A few regular customers waved at her. She greeted them warmly. The manager gave the team a quick reminder to stay sharp because an important guest had made a reservation. Around 8 o'clock, the doors opened, and a group of well-dressed men walked in. Their suits were tailored perfectly. Their watches caught the light. Their voices were loud enough to turn heads. At the center of the group was a rich businessman known in the city for his bold personality and strong opinions. He owned several companies and often hosted dinners at the restaurant. He walked with confidence, as if every room belonged to him. The host led them to a large table near the center. Laughter followed them. Chairs scraped against the floor as they sat. She was assigned to their table along with another server. She took a slow breath before approaching. Large tables like this could mean big tips, but they could also mean long hours and high demands. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said with a calm smile. "Can I start you off with something to drink?" The businessman barely looked at her at first. He was busy telling a story to the others. When she returned with their drinks, he finally glanced up. His eyes moved over her for a moment, not unkindly but not warmly either, just quickly as if deciding something. Throughout the evening, the table grew louder. They ordered expensive dishes and bottles of wine. They spoke about investments, properties, and travel. She moved in and out of their space carefully, setting plates down at the right time, clearing glasses before they were empty. At one point, while waiting for the kitchen to finish their main course, she stood near the service station. From there, she could see the grand piano across the room. The light above it reflected softly off its black surface. For a second, her mind drifted. She imagined how it would feel to sit there again, to press the keys, to hear a note ring out clearly in a room like this. She did not realize she was looking for longer than usual. When she turned back toward the table, she noticed the businessman watching her. He followed her gaze toward the piano, then back to her. A small smile formed on his face, though she could not read it fully. Later, as she placed the main dishes in front of them, one of the men at the table joked about the restaurant's live music nights. "You should get someone to play now," he said casually. "It feels too quiet." The businessman leaned back in his chair and looked toward the piano. Then he looked at her again. "Do you play?" he asked suddenly. The question caught her off guard. She blinked. "I'm sorry." "The piano," he said, nodding toward it. "Do you know how to play?" For a second, she thought about saying no. It would be easier, safer. But something in his tone made her hesitate. It was not exactly friendly. It felt more like curiosity mixed with amusement. "A little," she replied softly. The men at the table exchanged glances. One of them laughed lightly. "Well, that's interesting," he said. The businessman leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "A little," he repeated. "That means yes." She felt heat rise to her cheeks but kept her voice steady. "My father taught me when I was younger." There was a brief pause. The businessman nodded slowly, as if considering something. Then he leaned back again and took a sip of his drink. "Maybe later," he said casually, though his eyes remained on her a moment longer. She returned to the kitchen with a strange feeling in her chest. She could not tell if the conversation had been harmless or if it carried something else beneath it. Her coworker asked if everything was fine. She nodded and kept moving. But as the night went on, she sensed that the question had not been random. The businessman's glances toward the piano became more frequent. His smile returned now and then, subtle and unreadable. She focused on her work, reminding herself that she was there to serve, nothing more. Yet deep inside something stirred, a mix of nervousness and something else she had not felt in years. Hope. She did not know what the rest of the night would bring. She only knew that for the first time in a long while, the silent piano across the room did not feel so distant. The night continued to grow louder at the businessman's table. Empty plates were replaced with dessert menus. Another bottle was opened. The laughter became heavier, the kind that comes when people feel powerful and comfortable in their own space. Other guests tried not to stare, but it was hard to ignore such a large and confident group in the center of the room. She stayed focused on her work. She refilled glasses, cleared crumbs, and answered questions politely. Still, she felt the businessman's eyes drifting toward her from time to time. It was not the usual quick glance of a customer asking for service. It felt more deliberate, like he was thinking about something. When she returned with their desserts, one of the men tapped the edge of his spoon against his plate. "You know," he said loudly, "this place needs entertainment tonight." Another laughed. "Yeah, where's the music? I thought this was a classy restaurant." The businessman wiped his mouth slowly with his napkin and leaned back in his chair. "We were just discussing that," he said, looking directly at her. "She plays." The word hung in the air for a second. She froze slightly, holding a tray against her side. "I only mentioned that I learned when I was young," she replied carefully. "A little modesty," one of the men joked. "I like that." The businessman smiled, but there was something sharp behind it. "No need to be shy," he said. "We would love to hear something. It would make the night memorable." Her heart began to beat faster. Around them, other tables had started to notice the conversation. A few guests leaned in quietly. The manager, who had been near the entrance, now looked toward the scene with mild concern. She forced a small smile. "I'm working right now," she said gently. And I'm sure the restaurant has scheduled musicians for weekends. The businessman waved his hand dismissively. It's a quiet Tuesday, he said. There's no harm in a little surprise. Or was that story just a nice tale? The tone shifted slightly. It was still smooth, but it carried a challenge. She felt the weight of eyes on her. This was no longer a private exchange. It had become a moment, a test. One of the men at the table chuckled. Maybe she's afraid she'll embarrass herself. Another added, or maybe she just knows one song. Their laughter was not cruel in a loud way, but it had an edge. The kind that makes a person feel smaller without anyone raising their voice. She swallowed and steadied herself. She had faced difficult customers before. She knew how to stay calm. But this felt different. This felt personal. The businessman leaned forward again. Look, he said, lowering his voice slightly but still loud enough for others to hear. If you can play, then play. We're not asking for a concert. Just a little tune. Something simple. Something simple. The words echoed in her mind. Her father used to say that simple music was often the hardest to play well. She glanced toward the manager. He hesitated for a moment, then gave a small nod. It was not exactly permission, but it was not refusal either. Large clients like this brought in money. Keeping them happy mattered. She realized that if she refused, it might create tension. If she agreed and failed, it would confirm what they already seemed to believe. But if she agreed and succeeded, her palms felt warm. She set the tray down on a nearby station to keep her hands from shaking. All right, she said quietly. The businessman's eyebrows lifted slightly. All right, he repeated. I'll play something, she clarified. The table reacted with surprised laughter. One of the men clapped lightly as if encouraging a show. Now this is interesting, he said. Other guests turned their chairs just enough to watch without making it obvious. The room's energy shifted from casual dining to quiet anticipation. She untied her apron slowly and handed it to her coworker, who whispered, You don't have to do this. She nodded softly. It's okay. But inside, her thoughts were moving quickly. It had been years since she had played in front of anyone. Years since her fingers had touched real keys. She practiced sometimes on tabletops or by imagining scales in her mind, but that was not the same as sitting before a grand piano in a silent room. As she walked toward the piano, the sound of her shoes against the floor felt louder than usual. The lights above the instrument reflected against its smooth black surface. Up close, it looked even more beautiful than it did from a distance. For a brief second, she saw herself as a little girl again, feet barely touching the ground, her father sitting beside her. Listen before you move. She placed her hand gently on the edge of the piano. The wood felt cool under her fingers. She took a slow breath. Behind her, one of the men called out jokingly, Don't worry. We won't judge too harshly. More laughter followed. The businessman said nothing now. He simply watched. She sat down on the bench and adjusted it slightly. The room grew quieter than she expected. Even the kitchen noise seemed distant. It was as if the whole restaurant had paused. Her reflection stared back at her from the glossy lid. For a second, doubt tried to creep in. What if her hands forgot? What if the notes felt unfamiliar? What if she proved them right? She closed her eyes briefly. This was not about them. This was about the music. She let her fingers rest lightly on the keys without pressing them. The familiar shape felt almost like a memory returning home. Her shoulders relaxed just a little. From the table, a voice called out, Something simple, remember? A few quiet laughs followed again. She opened her eyes. Instead of responding, she positioned her fingers carefully. Not in a rushed way. Not in a nervous way. In a deliberate way. The businessman leaned back in his chair, arms crossed now. His expression carried amusement, as if he expected a short and awkward performance that would confirm his assumptions. She heard the faint sound of someone recording on their phone. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel everything. The fear, the pressure, the attention. Then she let it pass through her like a wave. Her father's voice echoed softly in her memory. Let the piano speak. She pressed the first key. The note rang out clear and steady, filling the room in a way no one had expected. It was not shaky. It was not hesitant. It was strong. A few heads lifted immediately. Conversations at other tables stopped mid-sentence. She moved to the second note, then the third. Slowly at first. Carefully. Not because she was unsure, but because she was building something. The businessman's smile faded just slightly, replaced by curiosity. This did not sound like someone guessing at keys. This sounded intentional. She continued, her hands growing more confident with each movement. The piano no longer felt like a stage for embarrassment. It felt like an old friend welcoming her back. The restaurant had gone almost completely silent now. Even those who had laughed moments earlier were no longer speaking. And she had only just begun. The first few notes floated gently through the restaurant, steady and controlled. They did not rush. They did not shake. They carried a quiet confidence that made people straighten in their chairs without realizing it. The sound was clear, warm, and deep, nothing like the playful, careless tune some of the men at the table had expected. She kept her eyes on the keys at first. Her fingers moved carefully, almost respectfully, as if greeting something she had missed for a long time. The piano responded to her touch in a way that felt familiar. The weight of each key, the slight resistance before the sound, the way the note echoed under the high ceiling. It all came back to her faster than she imagined. At the large table in the center, the laughter had completely stopped. One of the men who had joked earlier slowly put his spoon down. Another leaned forward slightly, his expression changing from amusement to confusion. The businessman's arms, which had been crossed in relaxed confidence, slowly lowered to the table. She moved from the soft opening into a fuller melody. Her left hand began laying down deeper notes, steady and grounding, while her right hand danced lightly above them. The music was no longer just a few simple tones. It was building into something layered and rich. The room felt different now. The air itself seemed heavier, but not in a bad way. It was as if the music had filled every empty corner. A couple sitting near the window stopped mid-conversation. The woman reached across the table and lightly touched her partner's arm, silently telling him to listen. Near the bar, a server stood still, holding a tray without realizing she had paused. She could feel it, the shift. Her fear began to fade, replaced by focus. The noise of the restaurant disappeared in her mind. There were no plates, no glasses, no whispers. There was only rhythm and breath. Her fingers no longer needed instructions. They remembered the patterns on their own. She let herself lean slightly into the music. The melody grew stronger, more expressive, carried something personal in it. Not sadness exactly, but depth. Years of quiet practice on imaginary keys. Years of holding back a part of herself. At the table, one of the men cleared his throat softly, almost as if embarrassed by how wrong he had been. Another picked up his phone again, but this time not to mock. This time to record something unexpected. The businessman's face had changed completely. The small smile he had worn earlier was gone. In its place was a serious expression, his eyes fixed on her hands. He was no longer watching her as a waitress performing a trick. He was watching a musician. She shifted into a more complex section of the piece. Her fingers moved faster now, but still clean and controlled. The notes rose and fell like waves. There was no hesitation, no searching. Every movement had purpose. A soft gasp escaped from someone near the back of the room. The music filled the high ceiling and came back down like a gentle echo. It wrapped around the tables and touched even those who had tried not to pay attention. It did not demand applause. It simply demanded listening. She felt warmth spread through her chest. Not pride, not yet. Just recognition. The piano felt alive beneath her hands. For the first time in years, she was not thinking about bills, shifts, or expectations. She was exactly where she wanted to be. Her mind flashed briefly to her father sitting beside her when she was small. He used to tap the rhythm softly on the wood when she lost her timing. He used to smile without speaking when she got it right. She imagined he would be smiling now. The piece grew more intense, then softer again, like telling a story without words. Some guests closed their eyes. Others stared openly, forgetting their food entirely. One of the businessmen at the table whispered under his breath, "This isn't simple." No one answered him. The man who had first joked about her knowing only one song now looked down at his plate, as if unsure where to place his eyes. The businessman in the center shifted in his chair. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, hands clasped. His attention was complete. The confidence he had shown earlier seemed distant now. She could sense the room holding its breath as she approached the middle of the piece. This was the part that required control, the part her father had always told her not to rush. She slowed just enough, letting each note land fully before moving to the next. The silence between notes became just as powerful as the sound itself. A glass clinked lightly somewhere in the room, but no one reacted. The music had taken over. Her hands crossed briefly, right over left, moving across the keyboard with smooth precision. It looked effortless, but it was not. It was years of memory guiding her without panic. A quiet murmur of surprise moved through the audience. The businessman's jaw tightened slightly. It was not anger. It was realization. She was not playing to impress them anymore. She was playing because the music demanded to be finished properly, because it deserved respect. The melody climbed higher, bright and clear, then dropped gently into deeper notes that resonated like a heartbeat. The sound vibrated in the wooden floors and in the chests of those listening. One of the servers near the kitchen wiped her eyes quickly, pretending something had gotten in them. The piece began to approach its peak. Her fingers moved with speed now, but still without chaos. Each note was clean, each transition smooth. There was no showy exaggeration, no dramatic movements, just skill and feeling working together. The businessman slowly leaned back in his chair, but not out of boredom. He looked almost frozen, as if trying to understand how he had misjudged the situation so completely. She reached the final build of the melody. The notes rose one after another, climbing like steps toward something bright. The sound filled every inch of the restaurant. Then suddenly she softened. The last section was quiet and controlled. Gentle notes that felt almost like a goodbye. Her fingers slowed, pressing each key with care. The final chord came not as a loud ending, but as a steady, confident close. The sound lingered in the air for a long second after her hands lifted. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence that followed was deeper than any applause could have been. It was the silence of people adjusting their understanding. She kept her hands resting lightly above the keys for a moment longer, letting the last vibration fade completely. Her heart was beating fast now, but not from fear, from release. She finally turned slightly on the bench, looking out at the room for the first time since she began. Every face was directed toward her. The men at the table were no longer smiling. They were staring. The businessman's expression was unreadable at first. Then something shifted. Not humiliation, not anger, something closer to respect, though he had not yet found words for it. A single clap broke the silence from the back of the room. Then another. Within seconds, the entire restaurant filled with applause. It was not loud in a wild way. It was strong and steady, genuine. She stood slowly from the bench, unsure of what to do with her hands. She gave a small, polite nod, the same way she would after setting down a plate. But this moment felt nothing like serving food. As the applause continued, she glanced briefly toward the businessman's table. He was not clapping at first. He was simply looking at her. And for the first time that night, he looked completely speechless. The applause did not fade quickly. It rolled through the restaurant in waves, growing stronger as more people stood from their seats. Some guests who had been watching quietly now clapped with real energy. A few even whistled softly in appreciation. The sound echoed off the walls and glass windows, filling the space that had been silent just moments before. She stood beside the piano, her hands slightly trembling now that the music had stopped. While she was playing, she had not felt the pressure. But now, with every eye on her, the reality of what just happened began to settle in. She had not simply played a short tune. She had given a performance. Her chest rose and fell slowly as she tried to steady her breathing. She had walked to that piano expecting to survive a moment of embarrassment. Instead, she had reminded herself who she truly was. At the center table, the men were no longer relaxed. The energy around them had shifted completely. The jokes were gone. The casual smiles had disappeared. One of them shook his head softly as if trying to process what he had just heard. Another leaned toward the businessman and whispered something, but the businessman did not respond. His eyes were still fixed on her. Finally, he brought his hands together and began to clap. It was not loud or dramatic. It was steady, measured, but it was real. When he stood up, the rest of his table followed. That was when she felt something change inside her. Not pride exactly, but dignity. The kind that does not come from applause, but from knowing you stood your ground without lowering yourself. The manager approached her carefully, unsure how to balance professionalism with the moment. That was, he began, then paused, searching for the right word. That was impressive. She gave a small nod. Thank you. Before she could step away from the piano, a man from another table approached. He had been sitting quietly near the window earlier, dressed simply compared to the businessman's group. He did not carry himself loudly, but there was focus in his eyes. Excuse me, he said politely. May I ask where you trained? The question caught her off guard. I didn't train anywhere official, she replied honestly. My father taught me when I was young. The man studied her for a moment, then smiled slightly. He must have been an excellent teacher. She felt her throat tighten gently at the mention of him. He loved music, she said softly. Behind her, the businessman and his group were still standing. The room had begun to settle, but the attention had not completely shifted away. Phones were still raised. Some guests were already whispering about what they had witnessed. The businessman finally walked toward her. His steps were slower now, less commanding than before. The room grew quiet again, though not in the same tense way as earlier. This silence was curious. He stopped a few feet from her. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. You said you learned when you were young, he began, his voice no longer carrying that playful challenge. You did not mention you were this good. She met his eyes calmly. You asked if I could play, she replied. I said yes. A faint reaction moved through a few nearby guests who overheard the exchange. It was not disrespectful. It was simply honest. The businessman looked down briefly, then back at her. That was not simple, he admitted. No, she said gently. It wasn't. There was no anger in her tone. No sarcasm. Just truth. For the first time that night, he seemed unsure of what to say next. His confidence had not disappeared, but it had softened. He glanced back at his table, then at the piano. You surprised me, he said finally. She did not answer right away. Instead, she picked up the small cloth that had been resting on the piano's edge and carefully wiped a faint fingerprint near the keys. It was a simple action, but it showed something important. She respected the instrument, not the moment. Sometimes people are more than what they look like in one setting, she said quietly. The words were not meant to challenge him. They were simply true. He nodded once, slowly. Around them, guests began returning to their meals, though the mood in the restaurant was no longer the same as before. There was an energy of reflection now. Conversations had shifted. Instead of business deals and loud laughter, there were softer discussions about talent, opportunity, and assumptions. The man who had approached her earlier spoke again. Have you ever performed publicly? He asked. She shook her head. Not like this. He reached into his pocket and handed her a simple business card. If you ever decide to, he said, call me. She looked at the card briefly. She did not fully understand what it might mean yet, but she nodded politely. Thank you. The businessman watched the exchange carefully. Something thoughtful passed across his face. Back at his table, one of his associates called out lightly, You found yourself a star tonight. There was no mocking tone now, only surprise. The businessman returned to his seat slowly. As she followed to continue serving the table, She noticed the way their eyes followed her. But it was different this time. It was not curiosity mixed with doubt. It was awareness. When she reached the table, the businessman spoke again, but his voice had lowered. "I misjudged," he said quietly, so only she could hear. She paused for a second. In all her years working there, she had rarely heard customers admit something like that. "It happens," she replied simply. He studied her face, perhaps expecting bitterness or anger, but he found neither. She was calm, steady, the same person who had served them earlier. The rest of the meal passed without loud jokes or playful challenges. The men spoke in softer tones. A few even asked her small, respectful questions about music. She answered briefly but did not turn it into a performance of stories. She kept her dignity intact. At nearby tables, guests occasionally glanced toward the piano as if expecting another surprise. Some whispered that they had just witnessed something rare. When the bill finally arrived at the businessman's table, he looked at it briefly, then added something to it with his pen before handing it back. He stood, adjusting his jacket. As his group prepared to leave, he stopped beside her once more. "You should not hide that talent," he said. There was no command in his voice this time, just a statement. She held his gaze for a moment. "I wasn't hiding," she answered gently. "I was working." The words stayed with him longer than she realized. He gave a small nod, then walked toward the exit with his group. This time, their laughter was quieter, their steps less dominant. When the doors closed behind them, the restaurant slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Plates clinked. Conversations resumed. But something had shifted permanently. Her coworker rushed over to her. "I had no idea," she whispered excitedly. "Why didn't you tell us?" She smiled softly. "It just never came up." The manager approached again, this time with a look that mixed surprise and possibility. "We might need to talk about weekend performances," he said carefully. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she glanced once more at the piano across the room. It no longer felt distant or untouchable. It felt familiar. As she tied her apron back on and returned to clearing tables, she realized something important. The applause had been loud. The attention had been powerful. But the real change had happened in a much quieter place, inside her. She had walked to that piano under pressure, expecting humiliation. She had walked away remembered not as a waitress who tried, but as a musician who belonged. And somewhere in the city that night, people were already talking about the performance that no one saw coming. The restaurant did not fully return to normal after that night. Even when the tables were cleared and the lights were dimmed, something stayed in the air. The staff kept replaying the moment in their minds. A few of them gathered near the service station before closing, speaking in excited whispers. "You should have seen their faces," one server said, shaking her head. They looked completely stunned. She smiled but kept quiet. She did not want to relive the challenge or the tension. What stayed with her was not their surprise. It was the feeling of the keys beneath her fingers again. When she finally reached home that night, the apartment was quiet. Her mother had fallen asleep on the couch with the television on low volume. Her younger brother was at the small kitchen table, pretending to study but clearly waiting for her. "You're late," he said softly. She slipped off her shoes and sat across from him. "It was busy." He looked at her carefully. "You look different." She laughed lightly. "Different how?" "I don't know," he said, shrugging. "Like you're thinking about something." She paused. For a moment, she thought about brushing it off. But instead, she told him. Not every detail, not every word that had been said, but the important part. "I played tonight," she said simply. He blinked. "At work?" She nodded. His eyes widened. "In front of people?" "Yes." He leaned back in his chair, trying to imagine it. "Were you scared?" "A little," she admitted. "But once I started, it felt like I wasn't scared anymore." He grinned slowly. "I wish I could have seen that." She looked around the small apartment. There was no piano here. There hadn't been one for years. Yet in her mind, she could still feel the weight of the keys. The next morning, she woke up earlier than usual. Her phone, which she normally kept on silent, was buzzing on the small table beside her bed. She frowned and reached for it. There were several messages from coworkers. Then more, and more. One of them read, "You're everywhere." Confused, she opened one of the links sent to her. It was a short video clip. The angle was slightly off, filmed from across the room. But it was clear enough. It showed her sitting at the grand piano, the room quiet around her. The caption above the video read, "Waitress asked to play something simple. Watch what happens." Her heart skipped. The video had already been shared hundreds of times overnight. Another message popped up from the man who had handed her his card. He had found her through the restaurant's public page. His message was polite and direct. "Good morning. I meant what I said last night. If you are open to talking about opportunities, please let me know." She sat up in bed slowly. Opportunities. The word felt heavy. Later that afternoon, when she arrived at work, the atmosphere was different. Staff members greeted her with wide smiles. Even the manager seemed unusually careful with his tone. "We've had calls," he said quietly, pulling her aside near the office. "People asking about you." Her stomach tightened slightly. "Is that bad?" He shook his head quickly. "No, not bad. Just unexpected." A few regular customers who came in that evening asked if she was the one from the video. She answered politely, not wanting to draw attention, but the whispers continued. As the night went on, she noticed something else. The grand piano no longer sat untouched during the week. A small sign had been placed near it, "Live performance. Ask about our special guest." She stared at it for a moment. Her manager approached her again. "Only if you want to," he said carefully. "No pressure. No pressure." Felt like the opposite of the night before. This time, the invitation did not come from challenge or mockery. It came from recognition. Still, she felt unsure. Music had always been personal. It belonged to quiet evenings with her father. It belonged to memory and comfort. Turning it into something public felt both exciting and frightening. During her break, she stepped outside for fresh air. The city noise surrounded her. Cars passing, people talking, the distant sound of traffic lights changing. She thought about the businessman from the other night, about the way he had looked at her when the music ended. Speechless, she wondered if he had seen the video too. As if her thoughts had called him forward, a black car slowly pulled up near the entrance. She recognized it instantly. Her heart beat faster. The door opened, and the businessman stepped out alone this time. No loud group, no audience behind him. He walked toward the entrance, then paused when he saw her standing outside. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "I wasn't sure you'd be here," he said finally. "I work here," she replied gently. He nodded, almost awkwardly. "I saw the video." She studied his face. He looked different without the crowd. Less loud, more thoughtful. "It's been shared widely," he continued. "People are talking about it." She folded her arms lightly, not defensively, just to steady herself. "I didn't plan for that." "I know," he said quickly. "That's part of why it matters." There was a brief silence between them, but it was not tense like before. "I owe you something," he said after a moment. She raised an eyebrow slightly. "You don't owe me anything," he exhaled slowly. "I tried to make a moment out of you. Instead, you made one out of me." She did not smile, but her expression softened. "I shouldn't have assumed," he added. "I shouldn't have pushed." His words were simple, but they were clear. She looked at him carefully. "It's done," she said. "What matters is what happens next." He nodded slowly. "Exactly." He hesitated before speaking again. "If you ever need support pursuing this," he said carefully, "I can help connect you with people. Proper venues, proper audiences." The offer hung in the air. This was not the same man who had challenged her in front of a table full of laughter. This was someone trying to correct his mistake in the only way he knew how. "I appreciate that," she replied honestly, "but I need to think about what I want first." He gave a small nod of respect. "Fair enough." When he left, she stood still for a moment longer. Inside the restaurant, the piano waited. Later that night, after her shift ended, she walked toward it again. The room was mostly empty now. Only a few staff members remained. She sat down quietly and pressed a single key. The note echoed softly in the nearly empty space. This time there was no challenge. No audience waiting to judge. Only choice. For the first time since she was a child, she realized something important. Music was not just something she used to love. It was still hers. And now the world had heard it. What she decided to do next would not be about proving anyone wrong. It would be about deciding how far she was willing to go to finally choose herself. The days that followed felt unreal to her. What had started as a tense moment in a busy restaurant had now grown into something far bigger than she expected. The video continued to spread. Strangers left kind comments. Some shared their own stories about hidden talents and missed chances. Others simply wrote, "Go for it." She read a few messages each night before bed, not to chase attention, but to understand what people had seen in her performance. At work, the piano was no longer just decoration. The manager asked her if she would be willing to play twice a week after dinner hours. Not as a waitress trying to prove something, but as part of the restaurant's evening atmosphere. The first time she officially played again, it felt different from that first unexpected performance. There was no pressure in the air. Guests knew she would play. Some even reserved tables just to listen. She still wore her simple uniform, still tied her apron before and after, but when she sat at the piano, she felt like two parts of her life were finally meeting instead of fighting each other. Her mother watched one evening from a quiet table in the corner. She had not dressed up in anything fancy. She simply sat there with her hands folded, eyes shining with quiet pride. When the music ended and applause filled the room, her mother did not clap loudly. She placed her hand over her heart and nodded slowly. That gesture meant more than any standing ovation. The businessman returned again one night, but this time he did not bring a large group. He sat alone near the back. He ordered dinner quietly and listened without interruption. When she finished playing, he approached her only after most guests had left. "You look different up there," he said. She wiped her hands gently with a small cloth before answering. "How?" "Confident," he replied. "Like you belong there." She thought about that for a moment. "Maybe I do," she said simply. He smiled, not in a proud way but in agreement. "You do." True to his word, he had connected her with people in the music industry. Not in a dramatic way, not with big promises, but with small introductions. A local event planner invited her to perform at a charity dinner. A small cultural center asked if she would consider giving a weekend recital. Each opportunity felt like a door opening slowly. She did not rush through them. She took her time, making sure every step felt right. Balancing work and music was not easy. Some days she felt exhausted. She would finish a late shift, then wake up early to practice on a borrowed piano at a community hall. Her fingers sometimes ached, not from lack of skill, but from lack of regular training over the years. She realized that talent alone was not enough. She needed discipline again. But this time the effort felt different. She was not practicing because someone had challenged her. She was practicing because she wanted to grow. One evening, after a small but successful performance at the cultural center, the same man who had first handed her his card approached her again. "You have something rare," he said. "Not just skill. Story." She nodded slowly. She understood what he meant. People were not only listening to her music, they were connecting with her journey. A few weeks later, she was invited to perform at a larger venue in the city. It was not a massive concert hall, but it was bigger than the restaurant. The stage lights were brighter, the audience larger. Before stepping on stage, she stood backstage alone for a moment. Her hands were steady, but her heart beat strongly in her chest. She closed her eyes and pictured her father sitting beside her again. "Listen before you move." She stepped out onto the stage. The applause that greeted her was warm, not loud in a flashy way, but genuine. She sat at the piano, adjusted the bench, and placed her fingers on the keys. The first note rang out clearly, just like that night in the restaurant. But this time, There was no surprise in the room. There was expectation. She played with confidence she had earned, not been handed. The piece moved through highs and lows, soft moments and powerful ones. She was not playing to silence anyone now. She was playing to speak. When the final note faded, the audience stood. As she bowed her head slightly, she felt something shift inside her once more. Not fear, not relief, fulfillment. Back at the restaurant, her role had slowly changed. She still worked some shifts, but less frequently. The manager supported her schedule. The staff cheered her on. The piano near the bar became known as her place. The businessman continued to visit from time to time. Their conversations became simple and respectful. He no longer carried the same loud energy when he walked in. He listened more, spoke less. One evening, after she finished playing a soft piece, he approached her with a thoughtful look. "I learned something that night," he said quietly. She looked at him, waiting. "I've built companies by judging quickly," he continued. "Deciding fast. Most of the time it works. That night it didn't." She considered his words carefully. "We all misjudge sometimes," she replied. "What matters is whether we grow from it." He nodded slowly. "You forced me to." She smiled gently. "No, the music did." He accepted that answer. Months passed. Invitations grew. She did not become suddenly famous. She did not chase headlines. But she built something steady, something real. She began teaching a small group of children at the community center on weekends. Watching their small fingers struggle over simple scales reminded her of herself years ago. She found joy in guiding them gently, just as her father had guided her. One afternoon, her younger brother sat beside her during practice. "You're not just the waitress anymore," he said proudly. She laughed softly. "I'm still me." He grinned. "Yeah, but now everyone else sees it too." That was the true change. The world had not given her talent. It had simply witnessed it. One quiet evening, long after most guests had left the restaurant, she sat alone at the grand piano once again. The lights were dim. The city outside moved in soft shadows. She pressed a single key and let it ring. She thought about the night it all started, the challenge, the laughter, the silence that followed. She thought about how small she had felt walking toward that piano, and how strong she had felt walking away. Her journey had not begun with applause. It had begun with doubt, and it had grown with courage. She placed both hands on the keys and began to play, not for an audience, not for opportunity, but for herself. The music filled the empty room, warm and steady. This time no one was speechless, because now everyone understood.